Greetings. Welcome to the ONTIC Protective Intelligence Podcast. I'm Chuck Randolph, ONTIC's Chief Security Officer. From 30 years as a military officer and over 25 transforming corporate security teams to function beyond their traditional roles, protection, risk management, and threat mitigation have been front and center throughout my career. This podcast series will explore the turbulent world of risk, security, and protective strategies through conversations with leaders and innovators in the field. Now, on to the discussion. Well, this is a special edition of the ONTIC Protective Intelligence Podcast. I'm joined with fellow CCI member, Mr. Fred Burton. Sir, always good to share a microphone with you. And from across the water, our good friend Ross Hill from Insight Forward. Ross, Fred, welcome and good morning.
Morning, Chuck. Morning, Fred.
Good morning. Good morning.
You know, as we record this, we're looking at over 600 days of the Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And of course, we're looking towards the Middle East and issues. We're going on week 2 of a Israeli-Hamas war. Of course, there's always things looming in the Far East, and then there's always issues in crises in the South. I mean, Fred, we are seemingly in something that we like to call at ONTIC and others like to call a sense of permacrisis. And with that comes a lot of emotion, a lot of risk fatigue, and a lot of what I would say difficult times to do your day job, but also keep your eye cast on all these critical events. I mean, can you put some perspective to all this for us?
Well, first, Chuck, thanks for having me on, and it's an honor to be here with you and Ross. From my perspective, you look at this historically, having been in this business for a while, you certainly could go back, like many of us will be listening to this, and think about your time in whether it be Afghanistan, Iraq, or wherever you might have served. And I think it's critical for companies now to sit back and think about the ramifications, not only to their staff, that they might have a good understanding of their footprint and their locational information and so forth, and notifications and travel safety and all the usual boxes that you would check. But I think the impact in the Israeli-Hamas war is a little bit different because of our close relationship with Israel and the scope of concern for just staff that might have friends and family inside the country. So, I've answered several questions from folks around that issue, and how do you grapple with that in the workplace? To me, is one of those kinds of issues that not only affect corporate security, but also impact corporate legal, HR, and so forth. So I'd love to know what Ross might think about that.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Yeah, definitely we're in an environment now where for companies, they have this kind of multi-stakeholderism where everybody that interacts with the company, whether they're an employee, a customer, a client, however you want to describe it, the board, they want that company to kind of have a shared value system with them individually. And Israel and Hamas in particular is a very, very emotive issue on both sides. And so it's very difficult for companies, I think, to think about how do we deal with kind of our employees or our clients and customers that may have support for the Palestinians or may have support for the Israeli side of things, and kind of, how that clashes internally and externally.
It's interesting because many corporations probably don't want to have anything to do with geopolitics, but seemingly, to both your points, they keep getting pulled in.
Yeah, you can't escape geopolitics now. The direct impacts that it's starting to have with these kind of crisis situation, the wars that are popping up for multinational corporations, it is inescapable. And you as a security organization, you have to have the awareness of that, and you have to be thinking of that and what's around the corner as well as what's happening now.
Yeah, and to piggyback on what you said there, Ross, for me, watching the evolution of not only the development of the protective intelligence programs for multinational corporations globally, I mean, we still have a lot of ways to go with a lot of companies not there yet. But looking at the development of these geopolitical think tanks, for lack of better words, to try to make sense of the geopolitical threats, because I think you said it so well. Companies have to factor in geopolitics and the work they're doing today because of all the different ramifications that we're watching unfold now, not only with the Israeli-Hamas war, but Ukraine and the South China Sea, and the list just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, definitely. We're definitely away a little bit from, what you might think about as sort of proximity risk that we might have dealt with a lot a few years ago, where what's happening in the vicinity of our assets physically, that might cause us a problem. And now we're having to think much more broadly about how is geopolitics shaping and developing, and what are the actual implications of that, which is something slightly different.
Well, gentlemen, how do we fight what we would have called in former lives the BBC effect? And no offense to that amazing institution in your neck of the woods, Ross, but this idea that like, hey, the board, the CEO, the boss, I heard on CNN, Fox, BBC, this, but that's news and may not be germane to the company or germane to the operations.
Well, I think, Chuck, if you wind back the clock, I think starting with COVID, the emphasis on global security, geopolitics really started to, in many ways, elevate the corporate security programs at many companies that I've spoken to into having the proverbial seat at the table to try to help decision makers make sense of what's unfolding. So if you had developed a good baseline during the COVID lockdowns, certainly the Ukrainian war is something that caught everybody's attention. Mm-hmm. And now we're dealing with this current crisis, which it doesn't appear is going to stabilize anytime soon. And in fact, could get worse if threat actors like Hezbollah enter into the fray and so forth. So I think there's a natural desire, even if the C-suite or the CEO doesn't want to admit it, Ross and Chuck, your employees are still glued to BBC or NPR or whatever they're watching because they're trying to stay abreast of current events. So that's the reality of the workforce.
I think about Gulf War I and a little something that came out of that was lovingly called by some Combat News Network, CNN, and the ability to look at the conflict, if you will, unfold in what we thought was real time. And now fast forward to 2023, and what we thought was real time was light years beyond like real time. We are so close to the bang issue that it's almost frightening. I mean, and I think there's something in that for leaders and monitors of risk too, because you're just inundated with the information that's coming in. I mean, Ross, how you're the analyst of the crew. I mean, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think just to start with on that, the proliferation of mis and disinformation from the current Israel-Hamas war seems to be way above anything I've seen previously. Even, we thought Russia-Ukraine was bad, and this is, multiple times worse than that, I think. And that's led to, some interesting challenges about understanding really what's happening on the ground and how things are developing. And I think to deal with any kind of, consuming and triaging information, you have to make sure that you're getting your processes right and you're getting your checks and balances right. And you're treating that information in the way you would always treat kind of any information. How are you kind of verifying the source of that information, and then how are you kind of verifying the information itself? Because I've seen around this quite a lot of like immediate reporting of things that are coming out on social media, without seemingly any triage. So, there were reports a while ago that Hezbollah had entered the conflict. And I think there's this desire amongst some to want to be, I don't know, first to report or to prove that their outlook or their forecast was the correct one. And so they're getting some of those biases kind of creep into their work. And I think as you sort of go through your multiple crises that you're being involved in, you have to kind of understand your processes, have to understand your structures, and you have to make sure you're kind of continually working to those and keeping that checked.
We'll get back to the conversation in just a moment, but first, I wanted to tell you about the ONTIX Center for Connected Intelligence. In the world of safety, security, and protection, we know that gathering and sharing information is crucial. That is why we created the ONTIX Center for Connected Intelligence. The center is a hub for the ongoing exchange of security strategies and best practices, insights on current and past trends, and sharing valuable learnings through expert discussion and analysis. It's made up of seasoned experts with decades of experience across a wide range of disciplines. To find blogs, podcasts, webinars, white papers, and more, check out the center by visiting ontic.co/center. That's ontic.co/center. Fred, what's our duty to our employees? I kind of would add what Ross just said about disinformation. We have playbooks, but I believe you are correct. There's also a group of people out there pushing buttons, writing code, making coffee, whatever it might be, that are getting fed a lot of information from various sources that could be good, could be bad. I mean, as leaders, what's our duty to those folks? At what point do we step in and offer suggestion or just offer comfort?
I think that in our space, that it greatly behooves us as security practitioners, Chuck and Ross, to help the workforce make sense of the world from a strategic threat perspective as well as from a tactical impact, meaning, let's face it, we work with a lot of families that have young kids in schools and so forth. They're worried about everything from active shooters to how does the war impact us, to travel considerations and so forth. And I think in the nature of our business, we're always going to be working in these shades of gray to where we're doing a fair amount of just trying to help staff and even the bosses make sense of what might be taking place around the world. I just think that that's great customer service. And although it may not be in our job description per se, that it's incumbent upon us to do that as security leaders.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a moment in any crisis where you need a calm voice. We bring Ross on because he's got that calm British voice, and everybody automatically likes that. But I do think in a stressful situation, there does need to be somebody with a calm voice that says, let's maybe take a look at this and put some perspective around it. We say a lot at work, Fred, you and I deal with a lot of organizations and help advise a lot of people. And we often say, we're not here to tell you how to think. We're here to offer things to think about or what to think, because I think, Ross, you were alluding earlier to the emotional status of everything flying around. And somebody has to step back and say, so what to the organization, which is hard, I think. Hard as citizens, or if you were a former government or military, or like I said, people care deeply about other people in harm's way, regardless of race, color, or creed. And that all starts to have some effect. I mean, disagree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Fred made a really good point earlier about COVID and how so many security teams became like that primary kind of source of information response. I think that's because security teams are generally very good at being that voice of reason and, trying to have that balanced approach and trying to think about it in that so what to the organization aspect, and as difficult as it can be, remove some of the emotional aspects of it, which can be really hard sometimes, based on, especially now, based on the kind of images and videos that you see on social media and the reporting of the things that have occurred, to remain kind of, balanced to that is hard.
I would like to ask you guys a couple questions, if I may, meaning I think we have a pretty good pulse collectively of what's transpiring currently throughout the world as it might pertain to Russia, Ukraine, Hamas, Israeli war. What do you think companies should be thinking about that perhaps they're not?
Yeah, that's the question, Fred. That is the easy and hard question. I mean, easy because Ross referred earlier. Hopefully, you've done and created a playbook by which let's dust it off if it's been on the shelf for a while or in the back of the old Commodore 64, and look at it and say, are we following it? Now, the difficult part on that is, I think, again, we're human beings. We're creatures of bias. We have to fight it every day, and we have to be able to tune down that emotion switch and say, hey, look, have we examined insider threat issues? Have we examined facilities or entities, their location? Do we know which areas would be most affected should course of action A or B happen? And that's where we include our protective intel analysts. Give us the red team, give us the what if, and then start working the playbooks, and then stopping at the end of the day and as a leader saying, what am I doing? Who have I told? Who needs to know? I mean, Ross, what would you add to that? We've worked together on things before, so I think we've done a lot of tandem work on this.
Yeah, I think if you look at the couple of major conflicts going on now, they're not new. They kind of emanate from historical issues and ideologies, and then look at, say, Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia and Azerbaijan, same thing. I think what you really need to do somewhat is kind of take a bit of a look back at the moment. As we got this massively globalized world that seems to be deglobalizing and pulling itself apart a little bit. So we do need to look back at kind of, okay, where do those fractures already exist, and how are they exacerbated by what's going on? Something I've talked about previously on other things is I changed my mindset in how I looked at things to when I start looking at where risks are, what's going to accelerate that risk, what's going to amplify that risk, or what is going to catalyze a new risk. Because, Fred and you have been around a bit longer. You can see things happening in cycles. You can see, old risks re-emerging. And I think understanding that is really, really, really important.
Are you talking about blips and trends, perhaps?
Blips and trends also, yeah. What are actual trends in the security environment or the geopolitical environment? What are smaller blips, that we maybe don't need to respond to? Not everything's a crisis. I think there's a habit actually in security of, once you get into crisis mode, suddenly kind of it feels like everything is a crisis. Or sometimes in a business, got into a rhythm of dealing with significant issues, and so you get into the rhythm of dealing with it in that particular way, and trying to recognize you might not need to do that, and applying your resources in the best way is also a good idea.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, most people I know who are in security, even if you came, if you didn't come from the traditional background, so to speak, they're all first responders at some level. I mean, I'm not conflating that we're first responders like fire or something else, but where we are in our moment, we're first responders in those organizations. And I think people do feel it passionately, and we do. I mean, the bell goes off, and here we go. Fred and I come out of the corners, get ready to duke it out, but maybe understanding like when to tone it down, that comes with some time, I think. I don't know, Fred, what would you add to that?
Well, I think Ross said something that is so true from a historical perspective, as I think the three of us are students of history to some degree. It's my books, my writings go back to the 70s and the 80s for the most part, and I'll never forget as a young agent walking into our counterterrorism branch, and my boss, who had been around a while, threw these old case files on my desk from these radical Palestinian attacks that had resulted in the deaths of American diplomats in Beirut and Khartoum and in hostage takings and so forth, and said, you need to study these because these kinds of tactics are never going to go away. And, here we are, 40, 50 years later, and we're still dealing with the same issues.
Well, Fred, I'd like to ask you that same question that you asked Ross and I. I mean, what would we add to this list of what organizational security leaders should be thinking about, or what organizations should be considering in looming multiple crises?
Well, I think Ross touched on something that, quite frankly, I think a lot of corporate security departments don't think about, meaning the processes or perhaps the baseline threat assessment that they might have done, let's say 3 years ago before COVID, and then maybe a post-COVID kind of threat assessment. I think it's always good in moments like this to revisit those baseline threat assessment and assumptions, try to turn that into a more of a living threat assessment, which whether you want to look at that on a quarterly basis or whatever, and adjust accordingly, and just be flexible when it comes to the kinds of requests that you're going to get, and try to do a fair amount of education for your staff on what this might mean to not only the company, but also what it might mean to Ross Hill or Chuck Randolph, or to that person that's sitting in the crowd that may not want to answer that question.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. And it is a time also, I think, adding to that, we have the idea of we talked about the playbook. And if reaction one is react to crisis, we can come up, I think, with a generalized framework that most probably have around that. I mean, thoughts on that, Ross, Fred?
Well, I think from an intelligence perspective, certainly I'm an advocate for having worked out together those intelligence requirements. Whether they're kind of like a bit like what Fred just said, the standing intelligence requirements that are giving you kind of your constant monitoring of the general situation, and then your understanding of how things might be emerging or developing or changing, versus some kind of more immediate requirements that that you're going to need in a crisis situation. And I think if you can have at least just like a first few of like, okay, so when something goes bang somewhere, these are the immediate things that we need to know. That's really helpful in terms of kind of helping your decision making along and helping your understanding along of what's happening. Because the worst thing you ever got in a crisis was like, tell me what's happening in Egypt. And it's like, it's difficult to deal with that, but it's like, where are our offices in Egypt? Are there protests occurring, near to those offices, or how far away are they? And, building some questions on that, I think is, you can put into kind of like some kind of like process or sort of playbook type situation.
Yeah. I think about, I think about the organizational flinch. Speaking of using a boxing, Mike Tyson said everything's great. The plans are great until you get punched in the face. So I think one of the things organizations want to consider is, how do I fight through an organizational flinch so that we can get to the response? Like the moment things are happening, all emotions are on, they're on 11. Everyone's running around. I think you're onto something there. Like, hey, this is the time to just pull that out. Let's do the first 5 things on this checklist of reaction so we can get through that moment and get to the other side so we can react. I mean, what am I missing in that, Fred?
No, I think you're right. I think the evolution too of the GSOCs to me on a practical level is something that as your center of gravity for the management of those data flows that are coming in. So your analysts like Ross can help make sense of what they're seeing from a big picture. So I think that there's a lot to be said for some of the, well, let me say this. I think we don't give ourselves a fair amount of credit for what already is in place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And recognizing that we do have a lot of systems and processes that we can call upon to help us make better decisions as security leaders.
And maybe it's that moment in the flinch that we maybe sometimes need to be reminded, like take a Post-it note and write, you have resources, and put it on your monitor to remember, hey, it's not all on me. It's not all on me to make and understand all of it right now. Part of it could be as simple as we're finding out, we're developing the situation, we'll respond to you as soon as we can make sense of it. I mean, I think there's something to that a lot. Just a quick reminder that you have resources. Even if you're a one-person show, you have some resources that will help you.
And also, I think, in fairness to us too, collectively, from an analytical and from an intelligence perspective, we're sitting here today realizing that this is a dynamic environment, that yes, in all probability, the Israelis are going to go into Gaza at some point. So what should we be anticipating as a result of that?
Mm-hmm.
And secondarily, if, God forbid, Hezbollah enters into the fray, what should we anticipate from a ramification to that? And I think that's where, from an analytical perspective, having those either outside experts you can call upon to anticipate those kinds of shifts, or some sort of embedded analytical capacity to be able to already know what that means to your business.
Fred, somewhere Dr. Treston right now is raising his hand going, red team, red team, red team. Any thoughts to add to that, Ross? Not the Dr. Treston comment.
No, that's absolutely right. I think one of the other dangers, I suppose, is carrying on getting caught up in the day to day of what's going on. That there is obviously often a need for situational awareness of what is happening on a daily basis, but then the reality in the analytical capacity and then the planning capacity has to be with what Fred said in your forecasting and your indicators, and understanding under each scenario how you think this is going to develop and what that means to you
and the organization. And then going back to what Fred said earlier, and what is our response, both to enable the C-suite, to enable or to comfort our employees, if you'll allow me that, and then to help develop the situation as we move on. I mean, in our final few moments here, I mean, what would we be missing? Or if somebody's listening to this right now saying, great conversation, folks, really appreciate it, what are 3 things I should do right now in light of multiple crises throughout the world? We've kind of touched on these, but any final words of advice, Fred, that you would give people?
Well, I would go back and to your question on one, understand your global threat assessment. 2, do you have your tripwires or your warnings and indicators set up to cause any kinds of shifts in those? And 3, challenge those assumptions that you may have, incorporated into those assessments from 2-3 years ago, because, we are in a very dynamic kind of phase here.
Right. That's gold right there, because you're right. I mean, we could be in a company that at one time was seen as a shining star of the West in capitalism. but has that changed? And then over time, what maybe juxtapose that with what we feel the collective of our employee base or the microcultures within our company are thinking as well. And Ross, I've heard you say that before as well. So what would you add to Fred's comments there, Ross?
They were really excellent. There's not a great deal to add.
Fred's
to
like,
those,
of course they were.
Yeah. But, I think because of what we see now with mis and disinformation, I think it really is critical to have your trusted sources identified and ready to go for various different locations, various different types of incidents. Understand where you're going to get your information and your intelligence from at the start, so that you've got a baseline. There's nothing worse than going into something and thinking, okay, now I need to find like the best social media accounts I know are trustworthy to follow this situation, because there's so much information now trying to wade through that. So whether that's with great technology solutions that are available, or whether you're doing that manually yourself, I think that's really important.
Yeah, a couple of things that I would add to that. One is I think you both we've all kind of mentioned this. I mean, look, there's global issues have local problems. Global problems result in local problems too. Don't forget that. What's happening overseas, regardless of whether it's Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas, you name your hotspot, they could have ramifications locally, and things that don't have anything to do with you. A riot or a protest could pop up near your building that has nothing to do with you, but it still could disrupt you and your activity. The other thing I would think is, don't get tunnel vision. You can get so focused on the thing in front of you that we fail. I don't want to call it a black swan, but you just fail to see what would they say, the gray rhino that's about to run you over. And that might not be another major geopolitical issue. That could just be, it could be a ransomware attack. It could be a supply chain disruption. It could be any number of things. You've had a gas leak in a building and the place where you're creating microchips has gone down. I mean, so you must maintain some type of overlook on the threat environment. And then don't let perfection get in the way of response. And I don't mean don't accept anything less than quality, but you can't always wait for 100. You're never going to get 100% of the picture. So as Colin Powell once said, if you get 70%, at least you have something to move forward and you can adjust in flight. So I think about those. But yeah, this has been great, Ross. We appreciate you staying up and hanging out with us for a little while. It's easy to find Fred and I. I mean, how do people follow you and where can they find you to get a little bit more of this? Maybe follow the pestle and mortal and mortem, if you will.
Yes, if you go to the Insight Forward LinkedIn page or website, then you can find lots of interesting reporting. Hopefully, we do a weekly newsletter that's free if people want to sign up for that as well. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. But pleasure to be here. Honor to be with you and Fred and talk today.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Any last words?
No. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us today, Ross. This conversation that Chuck and I have had over the past 45 minutes or so is something we do all the time. So it was a true honor for you to join us.
It would only be better, Ross, if you were here and we were having barbecue, and then it would be so, awesome. Gentlemen, thank you so much, both, and we will chat soon. This episode was brought to you by the ONTIC Center for Connected Intelligence. Learn more at ontic.co/center. Again, that's ontic.co/center. It was produced by A.J. McKeon. Our music is a track called Monteverde Ride, and it was written by Brian Bristow and performed by the Smokin' Novas. Check them out on Spotify. Please remember to rate and review our podcast on iTunes and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have questions, we'd love to hear them. You can reach us at podcast@ontic.co or visit ontic.co/center for more information. Thanks for listening.